What's up, heathens? How y'all doing? Now, last week we covered like 1 to 2 points of this list that we're going through that are supposed facts about Jesus and Christianity. And there's an important point that I want to stress here, and that's the thesis of this entire list, is that all of these facts are only explained by Jesus being divine and rising from the dead. That is the primary thesis of this list, and it's very important for this particular episode. First, we're going to discuss a Nazarene decree that is regularly touted by apologists as proving that Jesus' tomb was found empty or that somebody stole Jesus' body or something like that. We're going to go through that first, which is kind of like the tail end of the second point from last week, but then we're going to go on with the rest of the points that are really easy to explain away. And just to be up front with you guys, today's video is going to be sponsored by the Chrestus app. So if you want to hit up its link down in the description, it's both on iPhone and Android. If you want to go down there, get the app. All of the information I'm going to present today is in that app. If you want to know more about the mythicist position and the arguments against mythicism and mythicism's like answers for those arguments, then please get the Chrestus app. So if you're interested in figuring out how dumb as shit this list is, then please stay tuned. Alright, so first we're going to start off with the Nazarene Decree.
Now, in case you're still doubting the Nazarene Decree is something that was found in the late 1800s, Claudius, the Emperor of Rome, from 41 to 55, issued a decree in which he stated that anyone found digging up a body would face capital punishment.
This particular section, which was read by my lovely fiancée KC, is not entirely honest or even correct. It's true that this decree was found, but the dating and location is not as precise as they would like to make it out to be. The best guess for the dating of this decree is a 100-year time span between 50 BCE and 50 CE. That puts it in right around the time when Jesus was supposed to be doing all of his stuff. I mean, as right around as we can get, I guess. So I can understand why apologists grasp onto this and really want to use it to prove that Jesus' tomb was found empty. But the most likely dating for this is somewhere in the middle. This is given by the fact that the edict just says Caesar and gives no kind of qualifying information about who actually issued the edict. Many scholars believe that this edict was made by either Augustus Caesar or possibly even Julius Caesar. Apologists love to appeal to the Claudius dating because that's what works for their time period, being that Galilee was under control of the Roman Empire. This neglects the fact that allied states would regularly defer rulings of this nature to the Caesars. It's also incredibly doubtful that this would actually come from Nazareth, especially considering the fact that the person that had the slab or owned the slab claimed that it was sent from Nazareth. This is because in the late 19th century when it was found, there were actually only 2 centers for antiquities trade in that area, one being Nazareth. Scholars actually place this slab as being found in either Samaria or Decapolis. This is primarily because of the plural use of gods in this particular edict. This is important because it makes it more acceptable by Greeks rather than Jews. And then finally, why would the Romans put up an edict in Nazareth where like 99.9% of people were illiterate and couldn't read? Why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense. All in all, the apologists are completely wrong about this particular edict. For one thing, originating from Nazareth, but from another thing, the fact that it proves that somebody stole Jesus' body from the tomb or that the tomb was found empty. I mean, that insinuates the idea that grave robbing was a new thing and that Jesus' body was the first thing to be robbed from a grave. In about 8 CE, a bunch of Samaritans went into a temple, tossed things about, manipulated bodies and whatnot. This is a more likely catalyst for this edict, especially considering in that area you would have had people that could read. Scholars do place it in either Decapolis or Samaria. So no, this does not actually prove that Jesus' body disappeared in some fashion.
All 4 Gospels attest to the fact that Jesus is risen.
It's funny that the apologists love to use the corroborating evidence of each of the Gospels, like each of the Gospels corroborating themselves about Jesus being risen. At the end of Mark, you actually have the women running away from the tomb and claiming that they said nothing to anyone. And it's not until the long version of Mark that was inserted in the 2nd century that we get that Jesus actually tells them to tell the disciples and everything, and they actually do tell the disciples stuff. So, originally, the women didn't say anything. Now, I'm kind of curious. If you experience something and then you don't tell anybody about it whatsoever, how do you write a fucking book about it? I'm just kind of curious. They didn't say anything. Then how did a book even come into being? Obviously, they told somebody. Last time we mentioned how the Gospels were changed to take out embarrassing things that happened, and this is the exact thing that I was talking about. I believe I even mentioned it last time. The Christians in the 2nd century took out the fact that Mark's Gospel ends with the women telling nobody. How else could the story have come about if they didn't tell anybody? The 2nd century Christians did this in order to not only take out embarrassing information, but also corroborate with the rest of the gospel. Another thing apologists like to assume about the 4 gospels is the idea that they were written by eyewitnesses, and they indeed were not. I mean, if they were written by eyewitnesses, they wouldn't need to refer to the Old Testament. They wouldn't need to use prophecies that they perceived in the Old Testament as being about Jesus as explaining why these things happen. It would just be eyewitness testimony. They saw it. They experienced it, not this whole callback to the Old Testament. The reason why they do this is because in the Bible, in the Old Testament directly, it talks about how you should not trust man and you should only trust God's word. This is corroborated by the fact that Paul stresses that he gets no information from any person on earth and he only gets it through revelation through Jesus or the scriptures. Those are the only trusted sources by these 1st century Christians. So even if there were eyewitnesses to this Jesus person or whatnot, nobody would have used that as evidence. They would have only used scriptures and revelation. An important fact to keep in mind about these Gospels and when apologists use them as supporting evidence for Jesus and his resurrection is the timeline of the Gospels. First off, you have Mark being written in the 70s, and we know that Mark was written in the 70s because it talks about the destruction of the Jewish temple. Now, with Mark writing in the 70s, that puts Matthew writing much later because Matthew uses a lot, if not all, of Mark. And then Luke uses some from Matthew and from Mark. So the natural progression of these particular Gospels are Mark being written in the 70s, Matthew being written in the 80s, 90s, Luke being written just after Matthew being in the early 90s to the very end of the 1st century, and then you've got John, who's a completely different Gospel, being written most likely in the 2nd century, but could have been written in the very, very late 1st century. What all of this means is that none of the Gospel writers would have ever been eyewitnesses to Jesus or his death, and so you can't use them as eyewitness testimony. They were all written by anonymous authors, and they were all changed throughout the ages by different Christians.
Paul, who once hunted and persecuted Christians, indicated that he saw the risen Christ in 1 Corinthians 15, along with 500, including the 12 apostles.
Okay, so? I mean, this particular point has no bearing whatsoever on whether or not Jesus existed or whether he was divine. I mean, in this particular point, it says the risen Christ, not the actual physical person, but this celestial hallucination of a person claiming to be the Messiah of Judaism. Now, Paul describes a number of different groups of people that have seen this risen Christ. As I just stated, this risen Christ is a celestial hallucination, and when he gets to the whole 500 people that witnessed this risen Jesus, I mean, group hallucinations have a documented past. There have been a number of different group hallucinations that have occurred, and the events that they supposedly saw didn't actually exist or happen. So this entire creed is just anecdotal with no actual support. Now, another common claim is that this creed was written shortly after Jesus died, and therefore that makes it the most historical statement we could get about what happened after Jesus died. But to be quite honest, I don't care if this was written right as he was dying right there on the cross. The mere belief that he died on the cross or whatnot is all you need in order for this creed to come into being. I mean, it's perfectly reasonable that they had hallucinations and they read way too much into the scriptures and developed this same idea because all of these people were getting their ideas from the same place. So this particular creed that they always want to bring up has no legitimate place in the discussion of whether or not Jesus was historical, let alone whether he was divine.
Early Christians, including Paul, Peter, Stephen, and James, were often beaten, jailed, stoned, hung on crosses, or beheaded. They preached for decades, stating that they saw the risen Christ. Examples can be found in Acts, the Epistles, and in external writings by Polycarp, Pliny the Younger, and Tacitus.
This has no bearing on historicity of Jesus or of the truthfulness of Christianity. People dying for a false belief happen all the time, so I don't know why you think that this would be convincing to anybody. If this particular evidence is legit evidence that all of that stuff happened, Jesus dying on the cross, rising again, then you would also have to admit that the people that die for Islam and suicide bombs and all this other, for any other faith around the world, if they died for it, that means that it must be true. And it's just, that's not a good criteria for evidence for a historical figure like Jesus. So basically this argument is useless. Now generally apologists like to bring up Acts as proving that these people did in fact die for their faith, thus making the faith true and accurate in like history and stuff. Acts is mostly historical fiction. Richard Pervo, Dennis MacDonald, Brandel Helms, John Dominic Crossan, Thomas Brodie, Claire Rothschild, Loveday Alexander, and P.E. Satterthwaite would all agree that Acts is in no way historical. They have their own books and papers and peer-reviewed journals that attest to the fact that, Acts was comprised of many different works and from many different people in the past in order to present this narrative not only about Jesus, but also about the apostles doing their apostling. Of course, this is just me playing the who's got more scholars game, or who even has scholars kind of game, but no matter how many scholars agree on one particular aspect, it does not attest to the logic of the argument being made. The fact that Paul's shipwrecks bear a striking resemblance to the shipwrecks that Odysseus went through is pretty damning evidence that those bits are definitely fictional, as well as the rest of Acts. Josephus was used to put in some colorful background for the story, and many other historical writings in the past were used as templates for Acts. And this is all supported by the authors that I've given you already. If you want to learn more about how Acts is historical fiction, then I have a list of many different books and papers down below that you can find and read if you really want to. Some apologists tried to corroborate Acts with other historians that talk about how the apostles died, but all of these historians that they talk about actually come much later than Acts was written. So there's no way to make sure that these are actual independent accounts because they were most likely influenced by Acts, considering that they are mostly Christian sources.
Christianity was not legalized until 313, when Constantine legalized it.
No. Christianity wasn't outlawed prior to 313 CE and then legalized with the Edict of Milan. Christians were no more persecuted than any other religious sect at the time, including the Jews. But with this particular point, I want to mention how the apologists are literally complaining about not having special privileges or protections until 313. For 300 years, you were treated like every other person in antiquity, and your Complaining about not having special treatment? How childish are you? But again, think about what the whole thesis of this list of 8 facts about Christianity and Jesus. It's the idea that Jesus being divine is the only explanation for all of these facts. Jesus didn't have to be divine in order for Christians to be treated just like every other religious sect in antiquity. And just because Christianity was persecuted at times in the past does not mean that Christianity is truthful. This would be called a non sequitur argument.
Christianity started as a religion of peace, growing through the peaceful efforts of the apostles and disciples.
This again does not attest to the truthfulness of Christianity, and the idea that Jesus is divine is in no way an explanation for why this fact is a fact. I would agree that for the most part, most adherents to Christianity were not troublemakers and they just lived peaceful lives. Jesus being divine and all that is not an explanation for why this occurred. I mean, I get that this is just sort of a facts list, but you have to keep in mind the primary thesis of it.
By 313, Christianity had between 5 and 6 million adherents. See Dr. Jeffrey Warrow, 2008 Historical Atlas.
Doesn't this one seem kind of desperate? I mean, it's just an ad populum argument. Just because Christianity got popular by a certain date doesn't mean that Jesus actually died and rose from the dead, making him divine. Religions have become popular in the past when they've been based on non-historical things. Mormonism and Scientology are popular, but yet that doesn't make them true now, does it? And if you want to make it out to be like this religion survived in the face of persecution or something like that, you could say that about any religion in antiquity. They all face persecution. So if that makes Christianity true, then it definitely makes Hinduism true, Buddhism true, Islam true. Any other religion in the past is true because they face persecution. At this point, you have some apologists that would think that they have a lot of evidence for historical Jesus and the idea that Jesus was divine. And they will say that the best explanation for all of these facts that we've gone over here is the idea that Jesus is Lord. No, you haven't proven that Jesus is historical, nor is he divine. Some of these facts are just mundane things that can definitely be explained with just natural explanations, but the other things can also be explained with natural explanations and definitely don't need Jesus to rise from the dead in order to explain them. Thank you, heathens, for tuning in today. I really appreciate you guys sticking it out with me throughout this entire thing. If you will, please go down below, leave me a comment with what you thought about the rest of the facts on this sheet. Were you persuaded by them? Did you think that they were good? Let me know down in the comments. While you're down there, make sure you smash that like button and subscribe if you like this kind of mythicist content. Don't forget to stand up and use your voice, and I will see you heathens later.